Hello, everybody, and welcome to our latest podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the Operating a Home Start continuous self-assessment. My name's Yvonne Thorogood, and I'm the Quality and Learning Officer at Home Start UK. And with me, I've got Steve Griffiths and Tanya Samuels.
Hello, I'm Tanya Samuels, and I'm a Quality Improvement Specialist. I'm the member of the quality team who's responsible for sort of coordinating the consultations and the reviews of the mandatory policies that you'll be familiar with that you see on At Home.
Thank you, Tanya. My name is Steve Griffiths. I'm also a quality specialist in the quality team, and I coordinate the self-assessment programme. So, as Yvonne said, we're going to be looking at the Operating a Home Start standard. So on the 1st of February, that is when the self-assessment opens, and it closes on the 30th of April. So first of all, I just want to ask Tanya, we've now completed 2 rounds of continuous self-assessment and the quality team have evaluated those. Would you be able to give our listeners your main tips for completing the narrative in the self-assessment?
Yes, sure. I think it's, as with the other areas of the self-assessment, to be honest, Steve, that the narrative should be sufficiently detailed to explain that you've understood the indicator, and also to outline what sort of evidence you have for that. And if you are actually have said self-assessed and said that you're actually only partially met or unmet, that you clarify what still needs to be done to meet that indicator and when you expect to do that by. So I think that's the same areas really, to provide a consistent information in the narrative about what evidence you have and what areas have been met, and if there's anything that's unmet, what you intend to do about that.
Thank you, Tanya. So we're now going to move on to look at the indicators in the standard in a bit more detail. But before we do that, I'll just clarify, there are 9 indicators in total in this standard. 7 of them are requirements, which means you must meet those to be able to meet the standards. And 2 of them are shoulds, which are best practice. I also just wanted to make you aware that unlike the previous standards that you've worked on, the indicators don't run in a strict number order. They start at 005 and go on to 011, and then you also have 018 and 020. I wanted to let you know this so you don't get concerned if you can't find, for instance, OHS 001 to 004 on the web form, as it doesn't exist. And the reason for this is that a number of the indicators were removed from the standard when it was reviewed, but the remaining indicators were not renumbered. So we will sort that out when we next review the quality standards. So now, Tanya, I just wanted to talk with you about each indicator. Some of these are very straightforward, and others are a bit more detailed. So if we could start off with OHS 005, and if you could just say briefly what that's about and what we're expecting in the narrative, please.
Yes, right, thanks. Well, as you said, OHS 005 is actually one of the very straightforward ones. It just asks us about if your home start has at least 1 salaried staff member. So all you need to do for most home starts is just add the name of the person and say that's fully met. If for any reason you don't have a staff member at the moment, you could just outline the period for this has been without a staff member and what procedure is being followed to make sure that you meet that standard. OHS 006 is about paying the membership levy, which is an annual payment, comes around at the beginning of the financial year, and you just need to say that you've met that. In most cases, I think that's in almost all cases that will be the case. So those are both very straightforward areas. OHS 007 is that each Home Start must fully implement the mandatory policies. Now, these are the policies that cover any sort of key legal or regulatory standards that are required by Home Starts. And usually the evidence we'd be looking for in the narrative is to explain to us what policy table you're using. You'll see that there is one on at home that you can refer to, and it'll tell you when the policy was last reviewed and when it's due for review. And you might have a different way of approaching that within your service, but what is the procedure for monitoring that and checking that you're up to date and that you are in line with the review period as outlined at home? OHS 008 is the standard that covers the implementation of the core content of the model policies. Now, these are the policies which are a bit different to the mandatory policies we described in the earlier standard, but they tend to cover the operational aspects of running the service. So, for example, your financial controls policy and your employment policies. And here, Home Start UK provide an outline of what should be included in those policies. You'll find that on At Home, and you should just outline in the narrative how you go about checking that those policies are observed and reviewed, and how that's the procedure for doing that. The next standard is OHS 009, and this is about reviewing the policies, whether they are mandatory or model, and to check that that they are implemented in accordance with the review periods set out within the policy. So most of you will be familiar with the fact that we require mandatory policies to be adopted within 6 months of the review period. And what we'd like you to outline is the procedure that you go about for doing that within your service. So how the information about the policies is shared with your different individuals and staff, key bits of information for volunteers, how you check that they've all seen that, how you check that they different groups understand, appreciate any changes to the policy, and how you go about monitoring that these changes are actually adopted within your service. The next standard is OHS 010, and this is really about how trustees actively consider the funding and fundraising and establish a process for doing that and how they manage that locally. And obviously that's a key consideration for all Home Starts where funding is such a critical issue. So in your narrative, you might outline how that you go about this. For some Home Starts, they may have a funding subcommittee that's a combination of trustees and managers. Others, it may be done by the manager with one individual from the trustee group, and you might have a funding pipeline document that outlines when your funding is coming in, when your funding ends, and that sort of helps your Home Start to plan and monitor and manage your funding and make sure that you've considered different funding routes so that your service is sustainable and that you're looking ahead and planning ahead in terms of sustainability. The next standard is operating the Home Start is 011. This is about reportable incidents and to check that each Home Start is following the established process for doing so. And that might be reporting incidents to your regulatory body or to Home Start UK. So I think the key thing here is about making it clear that you're familiar with the reporting criteria for the different agencies, whether that be your regulatory body, the Charity Commission, whether it's Home Start UK or the ICO, and that you understand the timeframes and that key individuals in the service understand what those are and comply with those, and follow the correct procedure with each of the regulatory bodies. The next standard is about operating a Home Start is 018. And this really is around the naming convention, and that the name of each local Home Start, this refers to the name of each local Home Start, and it must reflect the operating area in which you are based. So, for example, if you expand your service, you need to consider whether that's consistent with the operating area in your in the name, and it follows the convention there. We do have a naming convention in Home Start UK, which you'll probably be familiar with, but if you need to check more information about that, that's on At Home. The last indicator is another should, and it's operating a Home Start 020. And this is about each staff member in the local Home Start should be registered with Homestart UK via at home, and that there should be an internal process for making sure that people are familiar with new staff, for example, are familiar with at home. They are entered onto at home and join at home, and they understand the different groups that they may need to belong to depending on their role and responsibilities within the organisation. And that likewise, that if a staff member leaves your organisation, that then you should follow the procedure to ensure that they are removed from at home, so that at home contains a current and up-to-date list of your staff members.
Thank you, Tanya. That's great. So we're now going to move on to looking at the evidence that you need to upload for this particular self-assessment. And firstly, I want to say that you don't have to upload all the evidence that you would be asked to do if you were in a full review process. So for this continuous self-assessment, we're just asking you to upload 2 pieces of evidence. The first one is your local policy review timetable, and the second one is your business or funding plan. Tanya, could you just briefly tell us what are the key things we will look for in those 2 documents?
Yes, well, I think with the policy timetable, it's really quite straightforward, that it should have each of the key policies, the mandatory and model policies, and that it should include timeframes for when they are reviewed, updated, and these should be spread throughout the year. And it should be clear about how those policies are both shared in the organisation and how they're adopted and approved. And that usually happens at board level through introducing the policy and sharing the policy with trustees, and then approving it following a discussion at the trustee meetings.
Thank you. So Tanya, could you just say a little bit about what would be the key things we would look for in a business or a funding plan?
Yeah, I guess the key thing is that each Homestart may have a different name for this document. Some are business plans, some are funding plans, some may be a funding pipeline. What we're interested in there is to check that the Homestarts are actually thinking about future funding, thinking about the different sources of funding that may be from fundraising events, from grants, from your contracted income, and thinking about the timing of that and the likelihood of it to continue, the time frames, so that we can see that local Homestarts are actually planning for when funding is coming to an end and proactively seeking alternative funding to ensure that the Homestart is sustainable and into the future, and that if one funding stream ends, they're considering a different funding stream or how to diversify in different ways to ensure their sustainability moving forward.
Thanks, Tanya. That's great. So that concludes going through the actual indicators and the evidence required for this particular self-assessment. I'd just like to say that some of you did experience problems with the web form last year, and we've now resolved these with the developer. So you will know that the form has been changed, so you will not be allowed to move on from one indicator until you've saved your work. So that means you can no longer input multiple indicators without saving. And this change will prevent your work getting lost if your session times out or you lose your internet signal. And that seems to have worked well since we made the change in October. Some of you were also having problems uploading certain documents and you were getting error message due to the size. There is now some guidance at home on how to resolve those issues. So please try that if you do come across that problem. If those tools and suggestions don't work, then please let us know and we will put you in contact with our colleague Mike, who works with our developer on the web form, and he will help sort out any issues for you. So before we finish, I just want to ask you to make sure that when you've completed your submission, that you can see that you've self-assessed against all 9 indicators and that you've uploaded the 2 pieces of documentary evidence that we require. We start our evaluation of your submissions as soon as the deadline of the 30th of April. And that's because we want to do justice to the work that you have all done. So we read through all of your self-assessments. We also review all the evidence you've uploaded. And we have over 100 submissions at any one round to go through. So we are very limited in the extensions that we can offer. So please make sure that you have done a full submission by the 30th of April. And thank you very much for listening to us. Goodbye.